Hello and welcome back to today's podcast. And I'm really delighted today to welcome somebody who's really inspired me over the last year. So I'm really excited to have him here with us, Dr. Scott Holland, who is a pioneering voice, if that's fair to say, in the field of theopoetics. So Scott is Emeritus Professor of Theopoetics and Writing at Bethany Theological Seminary, where he has also served as the Slabaugh Professor of Theology and Culture, if I have pronounced that correctly. But one of his many achievements has been launching and growing Bethany's Theopoetics program into a full Master of Arts in Theopoetics and Writing, offered jointly with the Earlham School of Religion. Scott has also directed the seminary's Peace Studies program and worked with the World Council of Churches. He is a prolific writer, essays and articles, and is also author of How Do Stories Save Us? Scott continues to teach and preach and inspire through his writing and public presence. And I have been very lucky to have experienced that this year, where I was also enrolled on the program, the Theopoetics program, along with a wonderful class there based in Bethany. So Scott, thank you so much for being with us, and you're very welcome to our podcast based here in Ireland. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Lena. It's very nice to be with you.
Thanks, Scott. So I wonder, could I maybe just start by asking you a little bit about your own background, just in particular, maybe what first drew you towards theopoetics and peace studies as the kind of the heart of your own academic and public work?
Yes, I would say that from the time that I was quite young, I had a deep interest in the arts, in music, in visual arts, and in the literary arts. And as I attended church and academic classes in religion when I finally made it to college, I was disappointed at times at the lack of artistic influence and inspiration in the teaching of academic theology. And I was drawn to explore those who perhaps came before the time of some of my professors who were exploring the arts more deliberately and discovered that in the 1960s there was a flourishing movement called theopoetics that emerged from a collective called the Society for Arts, Culture, and Religion. And so that really led me to do further research and led me down this path into theopoetics. And in terms of peace studies, I grew up downwind from Kent State University in Ohio, and on May 4th, 1970, students were killed when the Ohio National Guard moved in to put down a protest against the war in Vietnam and the invasion of Cambodia. And that really decentered me. I was very, very young at the time. I was in high school, but it made me ponder more deeply the problem of violence and the desire for peace. And so I moved in the direction of peace studies also, and then found it important and also intriguing to combine the arts with peace studies, because peace studies at the time tended to be quite politically driven, necessarily, and I was interested in expanding the scope of peace studies.
Scott, why don't you tell us a bit more about where you did go to university and what you studied, and did you explore theology in a bachelor's program?
Yes. So when I entered college and university, I went to two schools. I went to Kent State University up the road from my home. And then I also went to Malone College, which is a college in northeastern Ohio established by the Society of Friends. And so I
Mm.
did work at both schools and finally took a degree from Malone. And then after that, I did a seminary degree down the road again from where I grew up at Ashland Theological Seminary,
Mhm.
a seminary of the Brethren movement, which has roots in Anabaptism and
Mm.
Pietism. And then I studied at additional seminaries and divinity schools, including the Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminaries, University of Chicago Divinity School, and elsewhere. Did my doctoral work, some at the University of Pittsburgh Religions Department, but then finally finished my PhD at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, which has a strong tradition of phenomenology and a
Mhm.
very interdisciplinary program in which the phenomenology focus pulled together theology, philosophy, literature, and psychology. And so my doctoral work was quite interdisciplinary. And Duquesne has a very prominent center for the study of phenomenology, and I'm connected to that center. Recently, the theologian John D. Caputo, Jack Caputo, donated his papers, his personal papers, and his library to Duquesne's Simon Silverman Center for Phenomenology. And um, Professor Caputo and I have a friendship and a collaborative working relationship, especially around his more recent work in theopoetics.
Fascinating to hear your longstanding relationship with peace studies and the Anabaptist tradition and Friends and the Mennonites. That leads to my next question is I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about how you first encountered and developed an interest in theopoetics itself. Did you encounter that during your doctoral studies? I have a colleague at Duquesne, and I work in phenomenology myself, and I think they have a Levinas archives there as well.
Yes.
Excellent place to study. And I did hear about Caputo. You know, he's setting up his own archives there, so that's great. Did you discover theopoetics at Duquesne, or is this just something that sort of happens interpersonally when you met Caputo and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it wasn't at Duquesne where I first discovered theopoetics. It was actually in my more independent research quests for ways to bring theology and the arts into a more creative and constructive conversation. And so it was through that work and research that I discovered in the 60s this emergence of the Society for Art, Culture, and Religion. And I was happy to discover that it was not only academic, including many towering theologians, but it also touched the programming of the World Council of Churches and invited pastors and church educators into the conversation. And so, really, then I began doing some work and writing in theopoetics. It found its way into my dissertation at Duquesne, and I actually introduced some of my professors to the term, and they were happy to learn more about theopoetics.
Mm. Um, it's in when you speak, Scott, about your work in peace building, and that kind of connection, that you found. Like I feel a lot of resonance with my own background, um, I mean, I never heard of theopoetics until I kind of at this stage in my own life. But it's something that I've always done, and I do see that link very much to. I grew up in the Troubles in the North. I grew up very much in the 80s. I studied in Belfast and in the mid 90s. A very dangerous time. A lot of it growing up in the border area of the north of Ireland. So I do kind of understand that draw to even theology, the arts piece. It's all very much linked, and that I found that I just hear a lot within your own kind of your own story there. There's something about theopoetics, and I sort of feel with my own research in theopoetics that at the core of this work there is this concern about the flourishing of humanity, that we imagine, justice, peace, and this kind of common good, not as kind of a lofty ideal, but it's almost that it's, living lives marked with, depth and purpose, with ourselves, others, God, and world. And I came across, I'm really interested, particularly in contemporary theopoetic sites, and that's my own research area. And I'm looking at things like collective imaginaries and theopoetic imaginaries and how we kind of collectively make meaning together. So I'm really interested in that. And I came across a really powerful piece of art recently. The book was from Nicole Fleetwood, and it's Making Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, and it's about people who have been imprisoned in the US, and there's one particular self-portrait by an artist called Russell Craig, and the backdrop of this of his art has all of his criminal records, from his foster records when he was 5 right up to the documents when he was released from prison. But he has kind of reimagined and on top of this kind of this very static kind of background, he has depicted himself as a fresh haircut and glowing skin and this kind of he's emerging from this kind of background, and it's a very powerful way, and to me it's a real work of theopoetics. So I suppose, I'm just kind of, I don't even know what I'm trying to ask you here, but I'm just wondering, is there anything within all of that in your own work and peace building, or, has any of this kind of played out in your own work or reshaped the way theopoetics is understood, how we reimagine otherwise the idea of collective flourishing? Maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah, great reflections, Helena. Very much connected to my own understanding of theopoetics is this idea of human flourishing, that the world might flourish, and how do we get there? And I think some of my earliest work in peace building, peace studies, conflict resolution, conflict transformation relied too heavily on techniques that emerged out of academic peace studies. And it was really some of my work in the Federal Republic of Nigeria after some very violent clashes, interreligious clashes there, in which it seemed to me that some of those techniques really were not speaking to the human heart and to the human condition. Yeah. And I instead began to ponder what would best tap into the phenomenology of human experience, and invited those that I was working with, Christians, Muslims, and others who were involved in the conflicts, to speak out of their own lives. And I asked questions like, what is your favorite song? Do you have a favorite story that you could share with us? Which startled some of them because they thought we were doing serious political peace studies, conflict transformation work. And that gave rise to some deep human connections through the aesthetic, beyond simply focusing on the ethics of peace, that then gave rise to a more complex and artful ethics, of peace building. Because after all, when you ask someone to share their favorite poem, their favorite story, their favorite song, it's unlikely that someone is going to say, I really disagree with that poem. I really disagree with that story. I really disagree with that song. Whereas if one offers a political proposition or a theological proposition, that can invite that kind of quarrelsome response. And so the attempt was to find some common human phenomenological ground, if you will, uh, around the arts, around poetics in its broadest understanding, that is meaning making, composing meaning and then composing a life out of that, that brought theopoetics, the arts, into a really productive dialogue with peace building and peacemaking.
Can I follow up with a propositional question? It's not so clear to me how peace studies and theopoetics overlap or interconnect or dovetail into each other. I do wonder if you would be open to exploring varieties of definitions of theopoetics. Helena and I were talking about that before, and we've had Catherine Keller on a few weeks ago. And it's just really interesting to kind of push the boundaries of this very fertile but slippery term, theopoetics. Is it a type of theology? Is it a type of contextual theology, or is it something else?
Great question. And I would say that there is a variety of approaches to theopoetics that in our program at Bethany and Earlham, we acknowledge and indeed affirm and even celebrate. And if Catherine was on recently, you know that her grounding theologically is in process thought, process theology, process philosophy. And out of that emerged the path, if you will, to a particular theopoetic expression greatly informed by process. Some years ago in the journal Cross Currents, I published a piece co-authored by Catherine Keller and Jack Caputo. And Caputo's path to theopoetics is grounded much more in phenomenology than in process thought. As a matter of fact, he has just had a manuscript accepted by Columbia University Press that outlines his path from phenomenology to theopoetics. So I want to say, first of all, that there are a number of paths to the theopoetic and a number of theological influences in a variety of expressions of theopoetics. I would say that from the 60s on, those working in theopoetics have been interested in this notion of the poesis, the making of meaning, the composing of something that is ultimate, something that is satisfying, that leads to human connection with one another and with something beyond the holy, the sacred, the numinous, the spiritual, the divine. And so the way we work with theopoetics is to suggest that God never wrote one line of theology. We write it. And hopefully we write it creatively and constructively and artistically and spiritually and in an inspired way. So the poesis we're thinking about here is not simply versifying, suggesting that all theology must be written in lovely verse, although we're really appreciative of that. But this whole notion of poesis, of a composition. And not only are we composing a creative and constructive work, we are also interested in composing a life. And so we would say that the difference perhaps between theopoetics and some forms of theology is that theopoetics resists simply poeticizing a received doctrine and instead enters into the more artful process of poeticizing human experience, human insights that hopefully are touched by the numinous, by mystery. And therefore, one metaphor leads to another. One confession invites another confession. One story begs for yet another story in this process, if you will, of the theopoetic.
I think, Scott, you maybe presented this image one week during class. It was, and it's always stuck with me because it's made a lot of sense to me in terms of theopoetics, and it's the idea of the two type of theologians. You know, we have the ground diggers and the bridge builders. So the bridge builders, are building a bridge from this world to God, who is on high, and that we hope that our answers can hold up enough support to kind of hold up the bridge, whereas the ground diggers, I might be getting this wrong, but we don't have a bridge because God is actually the very ground on which we stand, but that we have to do a little digging to see that. So the bridge builders believe that the ground diggers are just building a hole, whereas because God is on high, whereas the ground diggers think the bridge builders are building a bridge to nowhere. But the theopoetics to me is that idea of the kind of the making and the rooted in the doing and the unearthing and the trying to uncover that kind of creative poesis, but there's something in that as well, and I think it's very really much related to Catherine Keller, her kind of theopoetic, the idea that in that making and in that doing, that not only what we are focusing on changes and we ourselves change within that creative making. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, very much. And sure, we did talk about that image of the bridge builders and the ground diggers. And in fact, on the ground, um, Paul Tillich's well-known description of the divine is being. And interestingly enough, Tillich was part of that original circle of the Society for Arts, Religion, and Culture in the 60s, and part of those early meetings that gave rise to the signifier theopoetics. And that conversation about God or the holy or the divine as the very ground of being, rather than a super being high in the sky, was very important. And I think also in concert with that, some of the early existential psychologists and psychiatrists entered this conversation, I think in particular of Rollo May, an existential analyst and a conversation partner with Paul Tillich. And from them came this idea that we are not just composing a theology or even composing a work of art. We're composing lives here,
Mm,
um, out of the very ground of our being, out of this connection with the divine.
mm. You mentioned a few really important people, Catherine Keller, Paul Tillich, who have been kind of formative in theopoetics and many other things, of course. But I mean, just for in terms of people who are listening today that might not be as familiar with it maybe as we are, is there, are there philosophers or poets or writers or theologians who you might regard as essential conversation partners in theopoetics in these different strands? And what is it in their work that makes them vital for kind of shaping theopoetic thought and practice?
Yeah, the two, I would say, most cited academic writers in naming theopoetics that come to mind in our program would be currently John D. Caputo, who's currently writing on theopoetics and the phenomenological path to theopoetics, and Richard Carney and his work, which comes more out of Ricoeurian hermeneutics and his background in philosophical and theological hermeneutics. Catherine Keller, of course, is very important when we think of not only process origins of the theopoetic, but her own work in echo
Mm,
poetics, echo theology, and also in the erotic, the classical understanding of eros as a yearning to connect with the holy, deeply with oneself, with others, and with all creation. Beyond those theological, philosophical, academic writers, as you know, we draw very much on contemporary poets
mm,
and creative writers who are attentive to the spiritual, but perhaps don't write in theological rhetorics, but are nevertheless alive and awake
mm.
to the poetic. So in our classes, we look at writers, poets as diverse as Christian Wyman, Mary Oliver, Louise Glick, and the list goes on and on and on.
You've mentioned, I can see why you're an excellent teacher, by the way. It's really lovely to listen to you outline the various figures and their kind of genealogies of influence. You mentioned music and poetry, theology, philosophy, psychiatry. I wonder if the word, if we could tease that out more, poetics, I wonder if that just means, and you can disagree with me here, does that just mean narrative making? So is it sort of a shift in our thinking from linear propositional thinking that theology is just a description of doctrine or how God is? It's a shift from that to narrative thinking, where we're making meaning through story. And in fact, Richard Carney would draw on Paul Ricoeur a lot, as you indicated. And I think Caputo talks a little bit about this too. I mean, you would know Caputo's work so much better than I would. But Caputo likes to talk about the kind of co-creative dynamic in which we bring about the event of God through our narrative making. And so my question is that what the poetic component is of theopoetics? Is it, or is it too simple to say it's about story and narrative?
No, it's not too simple at all. And in fact, my earliest work was in fact in narrative theology, and it was focused far more on how stories save us and on the narrative constitution of the self and the narrative constitution of meaning making. And so there is an important link there between story and poetics. And in fact, certain forms of poetics and poetry itself would be much more informed by narrative than others. So let's think, for example, of some of the confessional poets like Walt Whitman. When you read Leaves of Grass, we find these great uh, phenomenological slices of narrative, really. So much so that some of his earliest critics even ask, is this poetry or is this story? What is this? Because there is a very confessional narrative shape to Whitman's poetry. There are poets, however, who are far more focused on the symbolic intensification of word symbols that might not at first glance appear to be that story shaped, but the symbol itself, as Ricoeur would say, gives rise to thought, and that thought is often narrative shaped, right? Even as it returns to the intensification of the symbol. Some have said that the work of Louise Glück, for example, draws from her life narratives and presents them as a much more compressed symbolic intensification of language. But when one then encounters the poem, it gives rise to story-shaped thoughts, experience-shaped thoughts. So I think you're really onto something. There are really important links between poetry and narrative, and a poetics gives rise to both.
But I suppose, is it's fair to say though it's much broader, the poetics, because you've mentioned the word poiesis, which is making, and I think in life that is that's who we are. We are makers. I think it might have been Catherine Keller. I heard her speak on a podcast about our whole life is making. Think of our breath, how we kind of breathe out, and how we kind of the how see our CO2, the trees, everything is we're really interlinked and interconnected. So we are makers. This idea that, and the thing with theopoetics, that I mean, even in my own work, I've tried to make it broader than just poetry, because the poiesis is rooted in it's a much more uncovering a much deeper kind of is it Athanasius spoke about it in the 4th century. This is a doctrine that's kind of uncovering this kind of ancient making, the art of making. So poiesis, it doesn't have to be, poetics is not voices don't need to be academic, I suppose, in terms of how I would understand it, and that it's not a self-enclosing or a kind of a certainty in terms of theological meaning making, that there is this invitational, and that's who we are, and so yeah, I suppose I sort of see theopoetics as much broader than just theopoetry, or it's much more than that.
Yeah, indeed. It is the process of making. There is that text in the book of Ephesians from the King James Authorized Version. It reads that we are God's workmanship. In the original Greek, we are God's poem. We are God's poetry. We are God's poiesis. And so this gets to the idea that all of life can be a poiesis, a making, a creating. And while we look to the arts as probably the most explicit arena for making, there can indeed be a poesis of science. I recently spoke at the International Thoreau Society in Concord near Walden Pond. And this year we talked a lot about the early poetic science of Henry David Thoreau. Many think of Thoreau as either the Hermit of Walden, his book Walden, about the 2 years or so when he lived in the cabin, or the political Thoreau, his essay on civil disobedience. But many of his writings, and especially his journal writings, are really close examinations of the natural world and trying to understand how the natural world functions and fits together. And there is a kind of pre-scientific science in Thoreau's poetic, literary writings. And so we discussed how the first biographer of Thoreau called him a poet naturalist and focused a lot on the poetics of his natural observations. And I think that's very, very true. So poesis touches many dimensions of life.
Yeah, I think of Walt Whitman in similar terminology, a naturalist, obviously a poet. I love Walt Whitman. I'm using him a little bit right now on something I'm working on. I always imagine Whitman as the origin of theopoetics. He seems like that's what he's doing. I'd love to write a book someday on the kind of spirituality of Walt Whitman. But he is not interested in theology. He's interested in depth and mystery. He's interested in something like spirituality. And so that brings me to another, without getting too technical, or too abstract, that brings me to another question related to theopoetics. What or who is God in theopoetics? And I know it probably just depends on which theologian you ask, whether that's Catherine Keller or Richard Carney or John Caputo or Paul Tillich. And I think you kind of noted theopoesis challenges traditional conceptions of the divine as maybe a super being. And I don't think traditional concepts really say God is that. I don't think Aquinas would probably quite say that, or Augustine. But I know what you mean, certainly in popular piety, that God is some actual super subject or super ego, the God of the philosophers, something up there.
Yeah.
So how is this kind of dynamic, co-creative spirituality, which is not really theology, but kind of is, how does that bring about the divine? Is God a story? Is God a narrative? Or is God something more in theopoesis?
Yeah, wonderful question, and a question that most of our students ponder quite deliberately and seriously, because a number of our students remain connected to churches. Some of our students are even pastors who hold divinity degrees, and their own theology was not working well for them, as we see church attendance in sharp decline in UK and Europe and North America. And so many of them have been looking for new ways to not only name ourselves, but render God's name in all of history. Well, let's start, since you mentioned Whitman, with with Walt Whitman's own spiritual emergence and insight. What some don't know is that Walt Whitman's parents on Long Island attended Quaker meeting. And as a boy, Walt Whitman actually heard the preaching of the Quaker leader Elias Hicks. And in that genre of Friends theology, there was preaching. It wasn't simply silent meetings. We have a variety of Quakerisms. And Elias Hicks talked very explicitly about God being beyond us, but also God being that inner light within. And so that light is within all humanity and creation, and even beyond in some way, in some mysterious way. And some Whitman scholars would suggest that Whitman's poetics of every atom that is good within me is good within you also, in interesting ways, is a poetic restatement of the theology or spirituality of the inner light articulated and preached by Elias Hicks. And yeah, you're right. So in Whitman's work, he's not interested in theology proper, but he is interested in the spiritual, in the mysterious, in the erotic, in the very stuff of life. I would say that we in theopoetics, at least in our program, and as I define it, hope to be open to a multiplicity of ways in which to name who God is or might be. I preach in some congregations, and I do preach. I preached just this past Sunday, in which in the pews there's some with an inherited more classical theistic understanding of the divine who love the creative as well. There are some who have been influenced by the kind of panentheism of process thought. There are others who would boldly proclaim, I'm spiritual but not religious, not quite knowing how to define that, but feeling it more than defining it. And so I am comfortable entering into conversation and even Holy Communion with those who hold a multiplicity of understandings of the divine. Because one of my old friends and mentors, Gordon Kaufman, said, when we think about God, when we attempt to do theology, we do it in face of mystery. And Gordon taught me to be mindful of the fact that each person, if we really believe this, each person inhabits a different place in the mystery of God. And therefore, it becomes important to listen to one another, to learn from one another, and of course, at times to even challenge one another in this naming of God, but to recognize that God comes to us in mystery, and therefore we inhabit these spaces in the mystery of God. I was recently rereading that piece by the Jesuit theologian of the 20th century, Karl Rahner, and in 1971 he wrote that the Christian of the future will be a mystic or nothing at all. And then he goes on to define the mystic as someone who has really experienced something of the holy of God, without clearly defining what that is. So I think, especially in a world in which we are faced with so many fighting gods, and that's part of my work as a peace builder, is to make peace among the fighting gods. Um, my hope is to be open to many different namings of this mystery. I like Keller. I like Caputo. I like Garney. I like the guy down at the hardware store, who tells me, I heard that sermon you preached 6 weeks ago, and I really liked it because you said, and I think, I'm not sure I said that, but if you heard me say that, and uh, that spoke deeply to you, okay.
Um, yeah, I like that you opened your response to my question there with a reference to the sharp decline in church attendance. I think that's the academic study of the decline of attendance is like a cottage industry at this point. Um, and I wonder. I mean, it's in huge decline in Ireland as well. The Catholic Church is fallen off a cliff. But in North America, it is starting to catch up, and I just wonder if we could get more of your thoughts on that and why that's happening, and then maybe the theopoetic is appealing to people who are like you indicated, people who think traditional theology just doesn't work anymore. It's kind of a relic of the past. Um, how do we bring theology? How do we bring it into a contemporary space that makes it attractive and appealing and soulful? And is that what theopoetics is doing? Not that you're using it as an evangelization tool, but it's certainly trying to recover the mystery in things, the excess in things, and maybe that's just enough. That's where we need to continue to spend our time, is cultivating the mystery.
Yeah, yeah. Currently in North America, we are seeing um, the decline of church attendance and the closing of many churches. In fact, because I'm affiliated with a seminary and a school of religion that both are connected to congregations monthly, I am invited, often by phone or Zoom, sometimes in-person visits to churches that are facing the question, can we stay open? Because membership has fallen so dramatically. And it seems to me that we are living in a time, at least in North America, I can speak from this context, a time that seems to be both post-ecclesial yet also post-secular. Post-ecclesial, but also post-secular, in that most persons who are looking for a flourishing life are not simply content to celebrate the secular city. They're looking for something more, not sure what it is. They haven't found it in their home church. Some have, but many have not. And they're looking for something more. And I find it fascinating that those who have probably read little or no theology proper, when I use the term theopoetics, they focus and they say, well, I don't know what that is, but it sounds like something that I'm interested in. It sounds like I might think like that. It sounds like that might be something that I'm looking for. Tell me more. Tell me more. And often when I do, and obviously I'm not doing it as a point of evangelism, I'm doing it in response to a request for a conversation around ultimate concerns. It seems to connect.
Mm.
And again, some initially think, oh, is it all about poetry? Most get that it isn't just about poetry proper, but it's about apoiesis, a process of thinking spiritually beyond the flatly secular and beyond the old time religion that didn't seem to speak to them. So I'm finding that it does in fact connect. Uh, we can say that in our program at Bethany and Earlham, there was some suspicion years ago from our administrators that anyone would be interested in this.
Mm.
And the person who gave the green light on it was Bethany's president at the time, Ruth Ann Johansson Knuckle. And Ruth Ann Johansson, um, in essence, uh, said, let's try it and let's see if there's interest. And there has been interest. So, um, yeah, I think it is it is at least one possible path to reimagining the divine. I would say also the idea of building peace in a world of violence is another path, and rediscovering some social gospel on behalf of justice and peace building
Mm.
is attracting others. And with the current global violence, especially thinking about Gaza, this has actually brought some back to asking deeply spiritual questions. So, but again, for some of us, peace building is connected to theopoetics. So it's not a separate discipline over here.
Yeah.
I wonder how you might define theopoetics in the work of John Caputo. Just to plug him for a minute, some of our listeners may not know who he is or may not have read him, but I think he has quite a readership, a little bit of a following. He's written several accessible books. I've thumbed through them. His writing style can be quite engaging and poetic in its own way. And so he seems like an example of someone reframing and rethinking the divine in a very dynamic way. And it is appealing. It's striking a nerve somehow. Would you recommend as an entree into theopoetics the work of John Caputo? Would that be somebody that our listeners might want to explore just as an entree into the field?
Yeah, I think so. His his little book, What to Believe, published by Columbia University Press, is a nice introduction to his thought and to the whole broader notion of
Hmm.
theopoetics. That would be a place, I think, to start. For those who are a bit more philosophically, academically inclined, his forthcoming book, which will not be out until 2026,
Mm.
probably in the winter or early spring, uh, really tracks how phenomenology leads in the end um, to a theopoetics rather than to a mere philosophy or a theology proper, but to this notion of a theopoetics. I was one of Columbia's editorial referees for this book, and I think it's a really great book. Eventually, I will have a book in print that emerges from the two core theopoetics classes that I teach. Part of the challenge is that we use quite a bit of poetry in those classes, and it's very difficult to get all of the permissions to reprint the poetry. And I'm doing some serious editing now. So I would say in about a year or year and a half, you'll see that book also. It'll be called something like Theopoetics as Mystery, Metaphor, and Meaning Making.
Wow,
Thanks.
wonderful title.
Yeah. Scott, thank you. I'm just keeping an eye on your time. We don't want to keep you too much. You've given so much today, and such a really rich conversation, as I knew it would be. And just thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your time and everything with us. And we sort of started with, your own background and your own experience. And I suppose I'm wondering, is there anything next for you? What's coming up? And also maybe Joe might have a last question as well. Before we sign up?
Yeah, just to say thanks as well, Scott. You're just a natural teacher, and if there's not a reader in theopoetics, I don't think there is. Maybe there is. That would be an ideal book to put together at some point. I would certainly buy a book like that. But just to say thanks. We know that you're very busy speaking, and that you travel and you speak a lot, and you host conferences and workshops, and I suppose we would like to know what's next. Are you organizing any conferences or gatherings on Henry David Thoreau or theopoetics?
Yeah, well, thanks. As emeritus professor now, I have a bit more time outside of the classroom, and so I, as I noted, am writing this theopoetics book. I think the idea of a reader is a very fine idea. We don't have any theopoetics reader available, so that is a great suggestion. I do speak at many conferences. Just came off of the Thoreau conference. Every year, the Thoreau Society hosts a big Thoreau conference in Concord, right by Walden Pond. So I don't need to organize any Thoreau conference. I'd love to organize a Whitman conference. So Joe, maybe both of us could organize a Whitman conference, and I'd also like to
I
organize
love that.
another theopoetics conference. We used to have some conferences, and then actually the pandemic wreaked some havoc on some of our in-person conferences. So, Helena, maybe you and I can organize a theopoetics conference in the future. A piece of my work this year has been speaking on a topic called Anabaptism 500. My roots are in the radical Reformation of the 16th century, and this year is the 500th anniversary of the emergence of the radical Reformation, 1525, 2025. And so that's taken me a bit out of some of the theopoetics proper talks into speaking here and there this summer in Amsterdam and elsewhere on the radical Reformation. But you know me, I make it theopoetics, so my audiences can't escape theopoetics even when they invite me to speak on something quite historical.
Yeah, I think that's the year of the Peasants' War.
Yes.
I was just in Germany, and they were having 1525 signs up for some kind of theatrical reenactment of what happened Obviously, it was a really big deal in Switzerland and Germany, all over.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right. And
mm,
that helped give rise to the Radical Reformation because many of these reformers cared deeply about the concerns of the peasants. And so
mm,
there was a strong social gospel component in
mm,
that movement. Yeah.
mm. Fascinating. We could talk all day about theopoetics and even its genealogical roots in the Radical Reformation, which that sounds like there is something there. Um, but we'll just want to thank you again for taking time out and sharing your wisdom and letting us know what's new in theopoetics. And we look forward to reading your book when that does come out. And maybe we'll have you over again for the podcast and talk about your book.
Great. I'd love to do that. I've enjoyed this very much. So thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Scott.